They laughed before the auctioneer even finished the sentence. $3 for a dying horse, the old man shouted beneath the burning Texas sun, wiping sweat from his beard while dust rolled across the yard like smoke from a distant fire. Nobody raised a hand. The horse stood alone beside the broken fence, ribs pressing through its hide, one front leg trembling hard enough to shake the rusted chain around its neck. Flies covered the corner of its eyes. Its coat might have once been chestnut brown, but now it looked the color of old dirt left too long beneath summer heat. Men leaned against hitching posts with half-empty whiskey bottles, laughing low through cracked teeth. One cowboy spat tobacco into the dust and said, "That animal ain't worth the bullet." Another muttered, "Buzzards already circling." The horse lowered its head slowly, exhausted, while the auction moved on around it like the creature had already died standing up. But Elias Turner kept staring. He stood near the back beneath the shade of the feed store awning, hat pulled low, one hand hooked through his gun belt, though nobody in town remembered the last time they'd seen him draw iron. He wasn't young anymore, 38 maybe, hard miles in his face. The kind of man silence followed. His boots were powdered white from trail dust after riding nearly 40 miles through dry country with only $2 and some loose coins left in his pocket. He should have been saving every cent for winter feed. Instead, he walked toward the horse while everyone else stepped away from it. The animal lifted its eyes when he got close. That was the strange part. There was still something awake inside them. Not fear. Not pain exactly. Recognition. Like the horse had been waiting for somebody to stop long enough to see it. Elias noticed blood near the hoof. Old blood. Days old maybe. But the horse didn't snap or shy when he touched its neck. It just breathed slow through dusty nostrils while hot wind rattled the auction flags overhead. $3, the auctioneer repeated with a tired shrug. Or I send it to the glue works by sundown. A few men chuckled. Elias reached into his coat pocket and counted his money once, then again. 2 silver dollars. For quarters. Some nickels. Everything he had left in the world fit into one weathered hand. A little boy beside the fence looked up at him and whispered, "Mister, why buy something already dying?" Elias kept his eyes on the horse. Because nobody else would. Then he dropped the coins into the auctioneer's palm. Laughter rolled through the yard louder this time. Somebody clapped mockingly. Another voice called out, "Hope the horse survives the walk to its grave." Elias ignored them. He untied the rope carefully and led the animal away from the auction yard while evening light stretched long across the dirt road. The horse limped beside him through town, slow but stubborn, each hoof striking the earth with hollow little thuds that echoed between wooden storefronts. People watched from saloon windows as if they were seeing a fool drag home bad luck itself. By the time Elias reached his small ranch cabin 12 miles west of town, the sky had turned copper red behind the hills. He gave the horse water first, then oats softened with warm mash. The animal barely touched either. It only stood near the corral fence staring west into the darkening desert beyond the property line. Elias sat on the porch with a tin cup of cold coffee resting in his hands while crickets sang through the dry grass. The horse never looked away from the horizon. Hours passed. Midnight came soft and blue across the plains. Then the sound started. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Elias opened his eyes. The horse was clawing at the dirt with its front hoof over and over beneath the moonlight, breathing harder each minute as if something beneath the earth itself was calling it home. The scratching did not stop until nearly dawn. Elias sat awake on the porch the whole night, listening to the steady scrape of hoof against dry earth while cold desert wind drifted across the ranch. Every few minutes the horse paused long enough to breathe, then started again, slower this time, as though exhaustion itself could not overcome whatever stubborn thought lived inside its bones. By sunrise, the animal had dug a shallow groove near the fence line almost 3 feet long. Elias stepped closer with a lantern still burning weak in his hand. Dusty stood over the disturbed dirt, chest rising hard, dark eyes fixed west again toward the empty country beyond the hills. There was something unsettling about it. Not madness, purpose. The same kind a man carried when he walked into church after losing someone he loved. Elias crouched and ran his fingers through the loose soil. Nothing underneath except packed clay and stones baked hard by years of heat. Yet the horse kept staring west like it expected the ground itself to answer back. Morning came pale and quiet. Elias hauled water from the well while distant coyotes disappeared into the brush. He figured the horse would collapse before noon. Instead, Dusty finally touched the oats, drank deeply, then started pacing along the corral fence with more strength than before. Not healthy strength, nervous strength. By midday the wind turned hotter, carrying the smell of creosote and dry cedar from the foothills. Elias repaired part of the barn roof while keeping one eye on the animal. Every hour Dusty stopped whatever he was doing and looked west again. Always west. As the sun lowered behind the ridge, Elias saddled his own bay gelding for a supply run into town. The second he opened the corral gate, Dusty shoved past him. The old horse limped hard across the yard, nearly stumbling, but kept moving toward the desert trail beyond the property. Elias cursed under his breath and grabbed the rope before the animal disappeared into the brush. Dusty fought the pull only once, then froze completely, ears forward, staring into the distance. Elias followed the direction of the horse's gaze. Nothing but open country, red rock, mesquite, miles of forgotten land where old wagon roads vanished beneath drifting sand. Then he heard it, faint, metallic, like loose chain tapping against stone somewhere far off in the wind. Dusty reacted instantly. The horse jerked its head high and breathed sharply through its nose. Elias felt the tension move through the rope into his own hand. "Easy now," he muttered softly. But the horse was no longer looking at the horizon. It was listening. That night the air turned colder than usual for late summer. Elias ate beans from a tin bowl beside the fire while Dusty stood awake under the moonlight. Around midnight the horse suddenly let out a low sound deep in its throat and backed away from the fence. Elias reached for the rifle beside the door out of instinct, then stopped when he saw there was no predator nearby. Dusty was staring at something else. Not danger, memory. The horse paced in tight circles before stopping near the hitching rail. His hoof struck wood once. Hollow. Elias narrowed his eyes. Slowly he walked over and knelt beside the rail post buried in the dirt. The sound came again when the horse tapped it. Hollow underneath. Elias grabbed a shovel from the barn and started digging around the base of the post while cold wind pushed dust across the yard. 10 inches down, the metal edge struck something solid. Not rock. Wood. Old wood. Buried deliberately. Elias brushed away dirt with his hands until the corner of a small weathered box appeared beneath the earth, wrapped tightly in rotted canvas that smelled like rain and iron after years underground. Dusty lowered its head beside him and stood perfectly still for the first time since arriving at the ranch. The box came apart the moment Elias lifted it from the dirt. Wet wood cracked softly in his hands while flakes of rotten canvas drifted across the ground like dead leaves. Dusty stood beside him without moving, moonlight catching the edges of the old horse's tired face while the ranch stayed silent around them. Elias brushed dirt away carefully until he uncovered a leather pouch wrapped inside the broken box. The leather felt stiff from age, its surface stained dark from years underground. He loosened the strap slowly. Inside sat a silver pocket watch, blackened with tarnish, a folded piece of paper tied with faded blue thread, and a brass token stamped with the emblem of the Western Pacific Rail Company. Elias turned the token over in his hand. The date engraved beneath the symbol stopped him cold. 1868. Nearly 20 years old. He looked back toward Dusty. The horse lowered its head slightly, almost as if the sight of those objects eased something restless inside it. Wind whispered through the fence rails while coyotes cried somewhere far across the valley. Elias unfolded the paper carefully. Half of it had rotted away, leaving only fragments of words behind. Ridge, North Canyon, Silverwater. Beneath the stone arch, the rest was unreadable. But one thing remained clear at the bottom of the page. A name, Jeremiah Vale. Elias had heard it once before many years ago while drinking coffee beside a trail fire near El Paso. Some old drifter claimed Jeremiah Vale disappeared carrying payroll money meant for railroad workers building tracks through Apache territory. Some said he ran away with the gold. Others said bandits found him first. Either way, the money vanished and the company blamed the Apache tribes for years afterward. Elias stared at the watch again. The glass face was cracked clean through the center, frozen forever at 2:17. Dusty suddenly shifted his weight and lifted his ears toward the darkness beyond the ranch. Elias heard it too this time. Hoofbeats. Faint. Far away, but closing slowly from the eastern trail. He stood at once and tucked the pouch beneath his coat. Dusty backed away from the fence, uneasy again. The horse breathed harder now, nostrils flaring in the cold air. Elias walked toward the edge of the yard and peered into the moonlit distance. 3 riders moved across the ridge nearly half a mile out, their lantern light flickering weak through blowing dust. Travelers did not ride this late unless they had reason. Elias led Dusty quietly into the barn and shut the doors without striking another lantern. The old wood groaned softly while darkness settled around them. Through narrow cracks in the boards, he watched the riders approach the ranch road below. The lead horse carried a hanging brass bell beneath its saddle. Small, tarnished, the exact metallic sound Dusty reacted to earlier. The moment the bell rang again, the old horse trembled so hard the stall chains rattled. Elias placed one hand gently against Dusty's neck. "You know that sound," he whispered. Dusty kept staring toward the barn doors. Outside, the riders stopped near the water trough. Elias could hear leather creaking, boots brushing. Dirt, quiet voices swallowed by the wind. One of the men finally spoke louder than the others. "Tracks end here." Silence followed. Then another voice answered low and calm. "If the horse survived this long, somebody already found it." Elias felt the cold settle deeper into his chest. The riders were not searching for a lost animal. They were searching for whatever the horse remembered. The riders stayed near the trough for less than 5 minutes, but the silence they left behind felt heavier than a storm cloud hanging over dry country. Elias waited inside the barn until the last hoofbeat disappeared into the dark hills east of the ranch. Only then did he ease the door open. Cold moonlight spilled across the yard, silver against dust and fence posts, while Dusty remained frozen inside the stall, ears still pinned toward the trail. The old horse looked exhausted again, yet something inside him refused to rest. Elias stepped out slowly and studied the tracks near the trough. 3 horses. Heavy animals. Well-fed. Men with money usually rode like that. One set of prints stopped closer to the porch than the others. Elias crouched beside it and noticed the sharp heel marks pressed deep into the dirt. Whoever dismounted there had stood still for a long time facing the cabin windows. Watching. He rose slowly, eyes narrowing toward the empty desert. The wind carried only sand now. No voices, no bells, but the feeling remained. Somebody knew about Jeremiah Vale, and somebody believed the horse could still lead them to whatever had vanished 20 years earlier. Elias returned to the barn and lit a lantern low enough not to shine through the cracks. Dusty finally shifted closer to him for the first time since arriving at the ranch. Elias ran his hand carefully along the horse's neck, feeling old scars hidden beneath the rough coat. Not ranch scars, rope scars, travel scars, miles and years worn deep into the hide. "What road did you come from?" he murmured quietly. Dusty lowered his head near Elias's shoulder and breathed slow. The horse smelled like dust, sweat, and old leather left too long beneath sun and rain. Elias untied the faded saddle blanket still strapped. Beneath the animal's belly, it nearly fell apart in his hands. But stitched into one corner, hidden beneath layers of dirt, were 2 letters burned faintly into the fabric. J.V. Jeremiah Vale. Elias sat down heavily on an overturned feed bucket while the lantern crackled beside him. Outside, the night stretched endless across the plains. Somewhere far west, thunder rolled low behind the mountains, although the sky above the ranch remained clear. He unfolded the damaged paper again beneath the lantern light. Ridge, North Canyon, silver water, beneath the stone arch. The words circled through his mind until another memory surfaced. Silver Water was not a creek. It was an old Apache name for a canyon spring nearly 60 miles west near abandoned railroad survey routes. Most maps stopped marking it years ago after floods buried part of the trail. Few men traveled there anymore. Fewer returned with good stories. Elias folded the paper carefully and slipped it back into the pouch. Dusty watched him the whole time. Then, slowly, the horse tapped one hoof against the barn floor twice. Hollow again. Elias frowned and lifted the lantern toward the corner stall. The sound came from beneath old planks warped by age and moisture. He knelt and pried one board loose with the back of a hammer. Beneath it lay another object hidden in darkness. Smaller this time, wrapped in oilcloth. Elias pulled it free and unrolled the bundle carefully. Inside rested a revolver too rusted to fire, a compass with cracked glass, and a photograph faded nearly white with age. 3 men stood beside railroad tracks in the picture. One wore a dark vest with a silver watch chain hanging across his chest. Jeremiah Vale. The second man had a sheriff badge pinned crooked near his coat pocket. The third man had been scratched out completely, his face carved away with something sharp long ago. Elias stared at the damaged photograph while cold air drifted through the barn walls. Then Dusty suddenly jerked his head toward the western hills and gave a low, uneasy sound deep in his throat. This time Elias heard hoofbeats again. But not from the east trail. From the west. The hoofbeats from the western hills. Moved slower than the riders from earlier, steady and calm beneath the whispering wind. Elias extinguished the lantern immediately and stood motionless inside the barn while Dusty watched the darkness through the cracks in the wall. Moonlight painted silver lines across the floorboards. The approaching rider carried no lantern, no bell, just the soft creak of saddle leather and the low breathing of a tired horse climbing the ridge trail toward the ranch. Elias rested one hand near the old revolver tucked beneath his coat but did not draw it. Something about the rhythm outside felt different. Patient, careful. After a moment the rider stopped near the gate. Silence settled again. Then came an old voice from beyond the yard. "The horse remembers you already." Elias frowned slightly. The voice carried age inside it like dry cedar cracking beside a fire. He opened the barn door halfway and saw an elderly Apache man sitting atop a gray pony beneath the moonlight. Long silver braids rested against his shoulders. His weathered blanket coat moved softly in the wind while deep lines crossed his face like old riverbeds carved through stone. The old man studied Dusty first, not Elias. "I have not seen that horse in many winters," he said quietly. Dusty stepped forward the instant he heard the man's voice. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, the horse looked calm. Truly calm. The old Apache rider dismounted slowly, joints stiff from age, and rested his hand against Dusty's neck. The horse closed its eyes. Elias watched silently while cold wind swept dust across the yard between them. Finally he spoke. "You know him?" The old man nodded once. "His name was never Dusty." He paused gently. "Jeremiah Vale called him Ghost." Elias glanced toward the hidden pouch beneath his coat. "You knew Vale too?" The old man looked west toward the mountains before answering. He was one of the few white men who listened before speaking. They stood in silence a while longer. Somewhere in the darkness an owl cried from the cottonwoods near the creek bed. Elias finally motioned toward the porch. "Coffee is cold, but there is enough." Minutes later the 2 men sat outside beneath the pale moon while Ghost rested quietly near the hitching rail. The Apache elder wrapped both hands around the warm tin cup Elias handed him. "My name is Nantan," he said softly. "Long ago, Jeremiah Vale came west carrying silver and railroad papers. The company said the land belonged to them. Our people said the land remembered older names." Elias listened without interrupting. Nantan stared into the darkness beyond the ranch fence. Vale discovered the railroad men were cheating both sides. They planned to force tribes away from Silver Water Canyon after surveyors found silver veins there. Wind rattled through the dry grass. "Vale tried to stop it?" Elias asked. Nantan nodded slowly. "He hid the documents before he disappeared." He looked toward Ghost again. But men searching for silver only think like hungry wolves. They never asked what the horse remembered. Elias removed the folded paper and photograph carefully from his coat and placed them on the porch table between them. Nantan studied the scratched-out face in the photograph for a long moment. The old man's expression darkened slightly. "I know this sheriff badge," he murmured. The man beside Vale was Sheriff Hollis Barrett. Elias frowned. "Never heard the name." "Most young men have not," Nantan replied, "because powerful men buried his name along with the truth." Then the old Apache elder pointed toward the scratched-out figure beside Vale. "But that man," his voice lowered almost to a whisper, "that is the one who still searches." Cold wind swept across the porch hard enough to rattle the coffee cups. Elias looked toward the distant darkness east of the ranch where the three riders had vanished hours earlier. "You saying those men tonight know about this?" Nantan lifted his eyes slowly. "No," his face tightened beneath the moonlight. "I am saying they are afraid the horse might lead someone else there first." Morning arrived gray and cold beneath low clouds drifting over the western mountains. Elias had not slept more than an hour. The old photograph, the cracked watch, and Jeremiah Vale's name sat heavy in his thoughts while weak sunlight crept slowly across the ranch porch. Nantan was already awake before dawn, seated beside the fire with both hands wrapped around a steaming tin cup. Ghost stood near the corral fence facing west again, ears twitching every few moments toward the distant hills beyond the property. The horse looked stronger this morning, not healthy exactly, but driven by something deeper than sickness. Elias stepped onto the porch and watched the old Apache elder quietly for a moment. "You said the horse remembers," he finally said. "Remembers what?" Nantan lifted his eyes toward Ghost. "The last road Jeremiah Vale rode." Wind moved through the dry grass around the cabin while somewhere nearby loose fence wire hummed softly in the breeze. Elias sat down heavily on the porch rail. "Then why bury clues here?" Nantan stared into the fire. "Because Vale knew men would search his body first. Not the horse." Silence settled between them. Then the old man reached slowly into his coat and removed a folded piece of yellowed paper tied carefully with leather cord. "Jeremiah gave this to my father before he vanished." Elias accepted it carefully. The paper held a rough hand-drawn map of canyon trails west of Silver Water Ridge. One path circled a narrow pass marked only with a single symbol, a stone arch. The same words from the damaged note. Beneath it, written faintly in faded ink, were 6 words. "The earth remembers what greed buries." Elias read the line twice. "What is under the arch?" he asked quietly. Nantan shook his head once. "Nobody living knows." He looked toward the mountains again. "But powerful men have spent 20 years pretending it never existed." Before Elias could answer, Ghost suddenly raised his head sharply. The horse pawed once against the dirt and turned toward the western trail. Nantan stood immediately. "He wants to move now." Elias frowned. "Now?" "Before the others return." The ranch fell silent except for the wind. Elias looked toward the barn, then toward the endless country stretching west beyond the hills. 60 miles of rough land, dry riverbeds, broken canyon trails, places maps barely remembered anymore. Most men would have buried the box again and forgotten the whole thing. But Elias kept hearing the little boy from the auction asking why anyone would buy something already dying. He rose slowly and grabbed his saddle from the porch rail. By noon, the 3 riders moved west through open desert beneath a hard white sky. Elias rode his bay gelding while Ghost followed beside them carrying only a light blanket and water bags. Nantan traveled ahead quietly on the gray pony, guiding them through old trails hidden between red rock ridges and dry mesquite flats. Heat shimmered across the earth in silver waves while distant hawks circled above canyon walls worn smooth by centuries of wind. They stopped briefly near a shallow creek bed where old wagon ruts still scarred the ground. Ghost lowered his head there and sniffed the dirt carefully before continuing west on his own without guidance. Elias exchanged a quiet glance with Nantan. The old man nodded once. "He knows this trail." By late afternoon, clouds gathered thick over the mountains, turning the sunlight copper red across the desert floor. Then Ghost suddenly stopped near a cluster of weathered stones rising from the sand. The horse breathed harder and refused to move farther. Elias dismounted slowly and stepped forward. Half buried beneath dust beside the rocks lay the remains of an old campfire ring blackened with age. Nearby rested something even stranger. A rusted railroad survey marker hammered deep into the earth. Fresh boot prints surrounded it. Not old prints. Recent ones. Someone else had reached the canyon before them. The boot prints circled the survey marker like wolves pacing around a carcass. Elias crouched beside them while late afternoon wind carried dust across the canyon floor in long red ribbons. The tracks were fresh, no more than half a day old. 3 riders. Heavy boots. One man dragged his left heel slightly in the dirt with every step. Elias recognized the pattern immediately from the prints near his ranch. The same riders from the night before. Ghost stood nearby breathing slowly, ears turning toward the canyon ahead, while dark clouds gathered thicker over the western sky. Nantan studied the ground silently for several moments before speaking. They are close. Elias rose and scanned the ridgeline above them. Empty rock, empty sky, but the feeling of being watched had not left since morning. Can they know where the arch is? He asked quietly. Nantan shook his head once. If they knew, they would already be gone. Thunder rolled low behind the mountains. The old Apache elder stepped toward the survey marker and brushed dust from its rusted surface. Beneath years of weather and sand, another symbol appeared carved near the base. A circle split through the center by a single line. Nantan's eyes narrowed slightly. Apache trail mark, he murmured. Safe passage. Elias frowned. Jeremiah carved it? No, Nantan touched the symbol carefully. My father did. Wind swept harder through the canyon now, carrying the smell of rain somewhere far beyond the cliffs. Ghost suddenly moved ahead on his own between 2 narrow stone walls where shadows stretched long across the ground. Elias grabbed the reins quickly and followed. The canyon tightened around them until the air turned cool and quiet beneath towering red cliffs streaked black from old floods. Every hoofbeat echoed softly through the stone corridors. Then the horse stopped again. Ahead, hidden beneath the overhang of a massive rock shelf, stood the remains of an old supply camp nearly swallowed by sand. Rotting wagon wheels leaned against stone. Broken crates rested half-buried beneath dirt. A collapsed canvas tent flapped weakly in the wind like a ghost trying to rise. Elias dismounted slowly and stepped through the ruins. Everything looked abandoned for decades except for one thing. A small campfire pit near the cliff still held warmth beneath the ashes. Someone had been there recently. Very recently. Ghost lowered his head near the old wagon remains and nudged something buried beneath a layer of dust. Elias pulled it free carefully. Another silver watch. Cleaner than the first one. Its chain remained unbroken. Inside the lid was an engraving. Tahalis. Loyal men build empires. Elias exchanged a long look with Nantan. Sheriff Barrett, Elias muttered. The old Apache elder nodded slowly. The sheriff did not protect the truth. He protected the silver. Before either man spoke again, a sharp whistle echoed faintly through the canyon walls. Not close, but close enough. Elias stepped toward the cliff edge and peered down the narrow passage behind them. 3 riders had entered the canyon. Their silhouettes moved dark against the fading evening light nearly half a mile away. The brass bell beneath one saddle rang softly each time the horse stepped across stone. Ghost immediately backed away from the sound, muscles tightening beneath his worn coat. Elias reached for the old rifle strapped beside his saddle, but Nantan raised one hand calmly. No, the old man pointed upward toward a narrow trail winding along the canyon wall almost hidden beneath brush and shadow. There is another path. Thunder cracked louder overhead now. Rain began falling in slow, heavy drops against the stone while wind howled through the canyon passages. Elias mounted quickly while Ghost followed close behind Nantan's pony toward the hidden trail. Below them, the 3 riders continued deeper into the canyon. Unaware the storm itself was beginning to erase their tracks beneath sheets of desert rain. As darkness gathered across the cliffs, Ghost suddenly stopped halfway up the trail and turned his head toward a narrow gap in the rocks beside them. Elias looked closer. Hidden within the shadows of the cliff face stood the outline of a stone arch almost perfectly concealed by years of wind and drifting sand. Rain hammered the canyon through the night while lightning flashed white across the cliffs above the hidden arch. Elias stood beside Ghost beneath the narrow stone opening, breathing hard from the climb while muddy water rushed through the lower canyon below them. The three riders had disappeared into the storm somewhere beneath the cliffs, their voices swallowed by thunder and wind. Nantan pressed one weathered hand against the rock wall near the arch and brushed away layers of wet sand. Beneath it appeared another carved symbol matching the one from the survey marker below. The old Apache elder nodded slowly. "This is the place." Elias stepped closer. The arch itself looked natural from a distance, just another weathered curve of stone shaped by centuries of desert wind. But hidden beneath the overhang stood a narrow passage barely wide enough for a horse to pass through sideways. Ghost moved first. The old horse lowered his head and walked carefully into the darkness without hesitation. Elias lifted the lantern higher and followed. Cool air wrapped around them instantly. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling while the sound of the storm faded behind thick stone walls. The narrow tunnel opened suddenly into a hidden chamber deep inside the canyon cliff. Elias stopped cold. Wooden crates lined the far wall beneath layers of dust and old canvas. Rusted survey tools leaned beside them. Bundles of rolled maps sat stacked inside oilskin wrappings untouched for decades. But there was no mountain of gold waiting in the darkness. No piles of silver coins. Just papers, documents, records. The kind powerful men feared more than bullets. Elias walked slowly toward the nearest crate and pulled away the canvas cover. Inside rested leather-bound ledgers stamped with railroad seals and land deeds tied with faded red ribbon. Nantan opened another crate nearby. Silver bars lay stacked beneath the documents, dulled black with age but still valuable enough to change a man's life forever. Elias stared silently at the hidden room while rain echoed faintly outside the canyon walls. "Jeremiah hid all this here?" he asked quietly. Nantan nodded once. "Not for himself." The old man picked up one ledger carefully and opened it beneath the lantern glow. Inside were signatures, payment records, and agreements proving railroad executives bribed officials to seize Apache land around Silver Water Canyon after discovering rich silver veins beneath the mountains. Names filled the pages. Sheriffs, judges, bankers, men whose families still controlled towns across the territory. Elias turned another page and saw Sheriff Hollis Barrett's signature repeated again and again beside land transfers marked fraudulent in red ink. The scratched-out face in the photograph finally made sense. Somebody had tried to erase their part in the betrayal. Ghost stood quietly near the chamber entrance while Elias opened the final crate near the back wall. Inside rested a smaller metal box untouched by rust. He lifted the lid slowly. A letter lay folded neatly inside beside a polished silver pocket watch, still ticking faintly after all these years. Elias unfolded the letter carefully. Jeremiah Vale's handwriting stretched across the page. If this letter is found, then Ghost kept his promise better than men ever did. The silver beneath these mountains belongs first to the people cheated for it. I trusted the law once. I trust this horse more. Elias read the lines twice while thunder rolled deep through the canyon outside. Then Ghost suddenly raised his head sharply toward the tunnel entrance. Voices echoed faintly through the passage now. Closer than before. One man shouted over the storm. "Tracks end here." Elias extinguished the lantern instantly. Darkness swallowed the chamber whole except for flashes of lightning spilling briefly through the narrow tunnel outside. Nantan moved beside him without a sound. Ghost stood perfectly still near the entrance, ears pinned forward toward the approaching voices. Then the brass bell rang again somewhere beyond the storm, closer than ever before. The storm passed before sunrise. Rainwater still dripped from the canyon walls when the silence finally returned. Elias stood near the hidden chamber entrance with Ghost beside him while weak morning light crept slowly through the narrow stone passage. The three riders had never reached the chamber. During the night, the floodwaters rushing through the lower canyon forced them back toward open ground long before they found the hidden trail. Nature itself had guarded Jeremiah Vale's secret one final time. Nantan sat quietly beside the stacked crates, reading through the old ledgers while Ghost rested near the entrance with his head lowered for the first time since Elias bought him at the auction. Truly resting now. The fear inside the old horse had finally started to leave. Elias unfolded Jeremiah's letter again beneath the pale light. If this letter is found, then Ghost kept his promise better than men ever did. The words stayed with him long after the storm ended. By noon, they began loading only what mattered most onto the horses. Not the silver bars. Not the wealth buried beneath the canyon. The papers. The proof. Land deeds stolen through lies. Payment records signed by railroad men who built fortunes from betrayal. Names that still owned banks, saloons, and half the territory west of Texas. Elias tied the final bundle carefully behind his saddle while Nantan watched silently. Most men would have taken the silver, the old Apache elder said softly. Elias looked toward Ghost standing quietly beneath the stone arch. Most men did. Wind moved gently through the canyon now, carrying the clean smell of rain across the rocks. The ride back east took 3 days beneath clear skies washed bright after the storm. Word traveled ahead of them before they even reached town. By the time Elias rode down the main street beside Nantan and Ghost, people already stood watching from porches and storefronts. The same men who laughed at the dying horse days earlier now stared in silence at the bundles of railroad ledgers tied behind Elias's saddle. Sheriff deputies arrived first, then lawyers from the rail company, then bankers with polished boots and worried eyes. Elias said very little. He simply handed the documents to the territorial judge in front of the courthouse while half the town watched from beneath the afternoon sun. The silence afterward felt heavier than gun smoke. Within weeks, investigations spread across the territory. Land claims changed hands. Railroad officials disappeared from office. Families who had spent years pushed from Silver Water Canyon finally received legal rights to the land again. Some men blamed Elias for ruining powerful people. Others called him lucky. But every evening after the crowds faded and the dust settled, Elias returned quietly to his ranch west of town where none of those voices mattered much anymore. Winter arrived early that year. Cold winds swept through the plains while frost silvered the fence posts before sunrise. Ghost had grown weaker again. The old horse rarely wandered now. Most mornings Elias found him standing peacefully near the western fence looking toward the distant mountains beneath pale dawn light. One evening Elias carried a blanket outside and sat beside him beneath the stars. No words, just the sound of wind moving softly through dry grass. Ghost lowered himself slowly onto the earth beside the fence for the first time since arriving at the ranch. The old horse breathed deep once, then rested his head quietly against the ground facing west toward Silver Water Canyon. Elias sat beside him until sunrise touched the hill's gold. In the weeks that followed, silver buyers came searching for the canyon Jeremiah Vale had hidden. Elias never told them where it was. Some treasures, he decided, had already cost enough men their souls. Spring eventually returned to the plains. One warm afternoon, a small Apache family arrived at the ranch carrying fresh bread, dried meat, and a folded paper signed by the territorial court. The land around Silver Water Canyon officially belonged once again to the tribes driven away years earlier. Nantan stood beside Elias on the porch while the children laughed softly near the fence where Ghost used to stand. The horse finished the journey, the old man said quietly. Elias looked west toward the fading mountains beneath the evening sun. No, he answered after a long silence. He just waited for somebody kind enough to follow him home.